Hello, welcome everybody. Tonight we privileged to have Les back again. Uh, Probably an annual event, I think, Les. But he's well stocked with very interesting talks. And tonight it's why I am a humanist. Better just introduce a little bit about the Atheist Society. We have the lectures once a month. We don't have a formal membership, but we do have a mailing list. Okay, over to you, Les. Thanks.
Well, thanks for the invitation as well to do this talk. For those who don't know me, I'm currently on the board of Humanist Australia. I am also the events coordinator, so I manage the national speaking program for Humanist Australia. I was the vice president for what was then Humanist Society of Victoria back in the early 1980s, and then recently again, I was vice president for a year or two, a couple of years ago, maybe 3 years ago, now called Humanist Victoria. I also run the Philosophy Matters meetup group. Some of you may be members of that and go to those talks. And I also have my Rational Realm website where I put up my essays and talks. So thank you for coming tonight. So tonight's talk is why I am a humanist. Maybe we'll get a chance to talk about the intersection between humanism and atheism. So feel free to ask me questions or get into some discussion about that, this being the Atheist Society. So I plan on speaking for, should be not more than 40 minutes. If you have a quick question of clarification or you want to make a really quick comment, please do stick up your hand. And if you've got a longer, more detailed question or some more detailed commentary or opinion, please leave that till the end because we should have a good amount of time at the end. So what I want to cover today is three things. So I'll start by talking a little bit about my early life. So first I'll talk a little bit about my early life, and that's to give you a flavour of what I fell into humanism and what attracts me about humanism. And the second part, I'll talk about what I think humanism is, what I think are the three core elements or guiding principles of humanism. And in the last part of the talk, I want to say a little bit about the humanist conception of the good life. What is it about our lives that give us meaning and purpose? And how is that contrasted, say, with a religious view or some kind of supernaturalist view of the good life? So let's make a start. So autobiography. So this is a picture of the ship that my mother and I came over on from Hungary. This is the Fairsea. We arrived in Melbourne in 1957. And before that, my aunt and uncle left Hungary just after the end of the Second World War, 1948. So they lived through, and my mother lived through the Nazi occupation because the Nazis came in near the end of the Second World War into Hungary. So they lived through that totalitarian regime. And then once Europe was divided at the end of the war, in Hungary, my aunt and uncle then suffered under the totalitarian regime of Stalin. Incredibly stifling. And actually, Stalin took over my my grandfather's business. What do you call it when the government takes over your business? And my grandfather was a broken man after that. So my mother in 1956, I was born in 1956. I was 9 months old when my mother escaped over the border into Austria from Hungary. And there were communist guards at the checkpoints and they would shoot you on sight. So we were lucky to get over into Austria. So fleeing communism. So seeing my mother and my aunt and uncle, my whole family living under that absolutely stifling totalitarian first Nazism and then communism, it gave me a real distaste for governments to take away your freedom and discriminate against minorities, persecute minorities. So that was the first taste for the love of freedom. This is the house where I was brought up with my family in the 60s and the 70s. It looks better now than I think what it did then. This is in Airport West, a working class suburb in the northern suburbs. And both my parents, hardworking people in lower income jobs. My father was a fitter and turner. My mother was a sorter, a picker. She worked as a waitress, as a kitchen hand making sandwiches. So low paid occupations. Many times my father was out of work, sometimes because of he had a paranoia complex. He thought people were after him, and actually my father, he's my not biological father, my stepfather. He had 4 different psychological maladies. One of them was paranoia, hypochondria. So they were really challenging times, being poor, wondering whether my parents were going to be able to keep paying the mortgage. So I think, and then my stepfather suffering these mental challenges as well. I think it gave me an inkling into other people's lives who are living lives of hardship. And I think it continues with me today, empathizing with those people who are hard done by. And that's another core humanist value, compassion. So I covered 2 humanist values so far: anti-totalitarianism, liberalism. The next one, compassion. I was always interested in the sciences, and I started being interested in astronomy, really being experiencing wonder of the massive size of the galaxies, even of just the stars. And that interest in science continued all the way through till now. And being immersed in books about science sort of took me away from the drudgery and the anxieties of living the lives that we did, that were quite uncertain and full of travails. So my interest in science, or actually that's another humanist value, reliance on science and evidence. And that's another one of the things that attracts me about humanism. So my first interest was astronomy. Then I got interested in chemistry. This was when I was in high school, got interested in chemistry. And then I got interested in electronics. I perchance happened to pick up Electronics magazine and started to marvel about how you could put these little bits and pieces together, transistors, capacitors, resistors, and make up radios and televisions and transmitters and so on. So with astronomy, chemistry, electronics, you really get to delve into those fundamental constituents of matter, what scientists investigate: protons, neutrons, electrons, and so on. So I talked about the humanist value of reason and scientific inquiry, but there's the other side as well. When I was at high school, I got exposed to the social challenges, social and political challenges, and the ruptures in society and the demonstrations against the status quo. This is a picture of the anti-apartheid demonstrations taken at the CSG, Sydney Cricket Ground. Yeah, some of you who are my age may remember the Springboks tour, because they were touring around the world. This was a South African football soccer club that was, and blacks weren't allowed to be members of the club, as in sportsmen. So there were demonstrations all around the world against this discriminatory practice in South Africa. I mean, that was only one small part of it. There was a whole apartheid regime of separation of the races. So big demonstrations about that. And also, you know, another example, the big demonstrations against the Vietnam War. So our high school teachers started to kindle in us this curiosity and this questioning of the status quo. And that's really another hallmark of humanism, being engaged in the today's social and political debates and challenges. And in this case, advocating against discrimination of minorities and majorities, because in South Africa, the blacks were the majority. It was the Dutch that were the minority. And of course, questions about Vietnam, starting to raise in me some deep moral questions about, is there a just war? Can there ever be a just war? I know at the time we were asking questions about the millions of dollars that were being put into the space program, and whether that money put into the space program to put a man on the moon, whether that could be better spent saving children who were dying from malnutrition and from preventable diseases. So there are these two aspects which are reflected in humanism. The reliance on reason and evidence and science, and the other one about social and political engagement and going into bat for the people who are badly done by and discriminated against. So I think this active interest and participation in the great social issues of the day was another early marker for my latent humanist attitude. Humanists encourage all of us to play a positive part in the social groups to which we belong, our local communities, our state and our nation. But more than that, humanists impress on us that we are global citizens and that what we do at the local level impacts people in faraway lands that we will never see or meet. For example, how we eject pollutants into the air, manufacture and dispose of plastics, and buy more clothes from the fast fashion industry that we will ever wear, and how that impacts the child growing up in Somalia and Bangladesh. Of Humanist Australia's 9 espoused values, the values of community and resolve in the face of adversity best express this core humanist approach to life. Now, I'm so pleased to see how this humanist respect for truth and science on the one hand, and our recognition that we are truly living in a global village in which we are all responsible for each other and the environment, has been picked up by the young people of today. Respect and care for the environment is another one of Humanist Australia's 9 core values. We do encourage you to join us in we have what's called the Environment Challenge. And you can see that on the Humanist Australia website. So I'm thrilled that millions of people all over the world are taking the lead from 19-year-old Swedish ex-student Greta Thunberg, who's pictured here, and the other great young leaders. Through the United Nations and Humanist International, humanists are campaigning for much greater international cooperation and collaboration to meet the very real threats to ecology, human existence, and human welfare. But don't think for a moment that humanists are only concerned about human welfare. Don't be fooled by the name, humanism. From the time of the Enlightenment, leading humanists have been advocating taking into account the welfare of animals and other sentient life in our decision-making. The person who started off the modern animal rights movement in 1976 with his book, Animal Liberation, is humanist Peter Singer, pictured here on the left. Peter Singer is an Australian philosopher and ethicist who now teaches at Princeton University in America. So pictured on the left is Peter Singer. He was awarded the Australian Humanist of the Year Award in 2004. Pictured over there on the right with Lyndon Johnson is Lynn White. She's the Director of Strategy for Animals Australia, and she was awarded the Australian Humanist of the Year Award in 2019. So when it comes to how we treat animals, What matters for a humanist is not whether they can think, but whether they can suffer. Now, you may recognize that insight as being formulated by that great Enlightenment utilitarian philosopher, Jeremy Bentham, pictured there on the left. Along with Bentham, you may have also heard of these other seminal earliest humanist thinkers like Charles Darwin, David Hume, and John Stuart Mill. So Jeremy Bentham famously said in his book, Introduction to the Principles of Morals and Legislation, he famously said, the question is not for animals, can they reason, nor can they talk, but can they suffer? So here again, the young people of today are taking the lead. I speak with many under 30s who are taking an active role, campaigning against the suffering of livestock that we see happening on an industrial scale. This humanist attitude, this is the humanist attitude in action. And actually there on the slide, I talk about this animal suffering on an industrial scale. You see the battery hens down there in the bottom. They are so stressed out, they can peck each other to death. So the farmers chop off their beak and the pigs, they're confined so much they can't even turn around in their stall. This really is suffering. I don't think I'm exaggerating when I say that this is suffering on an industrial scale. So I see these same young people actively working in the effectiveness altruism movement. This movement was kickstarted by two humanists, Peter Singer and William McCaskill. A humanist recognises that in trying to do the most good that we can do, trying to minimise the suffering of humans and animals as much as possible, our resources are limited. With this humanist approach, we are applying scientific principles and methods in working out where we should spend our altruistic efforts for maximum impact. A great example of an organisation doing just that is GiveWell at givewell.org. And the URL is there on the right. So the big question is, you know, a lot of people, when they're thinking about what's the best way to spend their charity dollars, they look at efficiency, how much money goes to the administration when you donate to a charity. But the thing that most people don't look at is what's called effectiveness. So a charity can be efficient. Most of the money goes to the projects, but it could be very ineffective because it's giving to the wrong projects. There are other projects where the money could go, which will alleviate suffering much more than the project where your money might be going. So givewell.org is one of those websites that does this evidence-based analysis of charities to check for effectiveness and efficiency. So I hope you're getting a flavour for why I'm attracted to a humanist approach to life. Now, I want to change gears a bit now and talk a little about my life after school. But to make sense of that, I need to say a little about my church life while at school. Now, when I was 12 years old, and after an 8-week course of lessons, I received the Eucharist, or the confirmation at our local Catholic church, St. Christopher's. And I still have the certificate. I do this maybe for two reasons. One, to show that I was subject to indoctrination when I was young, and two, to show that have got some theological qualifications. Now, I can't remember what led me to do that, to get the Eucharist. Perhaps my devout Catholic aunt, very devout, had a hand to play in that. I do remember, though, that after I received my confirmation, I did not return to the church. That's a picture of St. Christopher's, where I went. I did go to a public school, not a private religious school. So also in my late teens, my wonky stepfather suddenly decided that our family is going to attend the local Protestant church, St. Philip's, and that's a picture of St. Philip's there, still standing. I quite enjoyed my time there, especially the Sunday school lessons that were run by a delightful young lady. As suddenly as my stepfather decided we were starting at the church, he just as abruptly decided we were no longer going. Now, my stepfather suffered from paranoia. That was one of his mental maladies. So he was thinking at times that people were after him. And that was one reason why he couldn't hold down a job, because he thought one of his boss or one of his workmates had slighted him. So I suspect it was some minor action by a church member that led my stepfather to abruptly cut all ties with that church. But in all of this, as much as I liked the people in the church, I never really bought into the key Christian teachings that the world was created in 6 days, that Noah saved a select few after a worldwide flood, that Jesus died for our original sin and rose from the dead on the third day. For me, these teachings just plainly contradicted what we knew was possible, given our scientific view of the world, and also just did not make philosophical sense. And maybe the biggest problem I have is what's called the problem of evil, how an omnipotent, omniscient, and morally perfect, perfectly benevolent God could allow such egregious pain and suffering in the world. Now, in my late teens, I also started reading some of the seminal atheist and humanist writers, such as Kit Mowat, Hector Horton, Margaret Knight, Julian Huxley. Julian Huxley was a grandson, you may know, of Thomas Henry Huxley, who was a friend of Charles Darwin. And of course, Bertrand Russell, pictured here. That reading, along with my interest in science, primed me for what was to happen next. Following high school, I enrolled at RMIT, Royal Melbourne Institute of Technology. It's now called RMIT University. So there I studied electronics for 4 years. That was my first career. In my class was a very committed Christian, Gary. Now, Gary and I were friends and we got on quite well. Now, but during lunchtimes and other breaks, we would get into some very vigorous discussions about religion. So much so that it piqued my interest enough to enroll at La Trobe University for a degree part-time. Now, I was still working full-time in my career in electronics. I was already a technical officer and we had 2 children coming along the way as well. So my main interests in philosophy were philosophy and history of religions, I should say. I studied there at La Trobe for 9 years while I worked full-time and started a family. I became interested in 2 key areas in philosophy. First, what's called epistemology, and that is the philosophy of knowledge, and ethics or moral philosophy. First, epistemology. We ask questions such as, how do we know what we do know? And how does the scientific method work? And in moral philosophy, we inquire into the nature and foundation for ethics and how we decide rationally the key moral questions of our time. These questions still interest me today. That interest is what motivated me to create my rationalrealm.com website and to start what is now a very active philosophy group, Philosophy Matters. It was when I began my studies that I first joined our local Humanist society, Humanist Victoria. Now, it was called the Humanist Society of Victoria back then. And in the last 5 years or so, I've become active again. I think it's more like 7 years now. And that's because I'm passionate about getting our lawmakers to use reason and evidence when deciding public policy and framing legislation. Like I said at the intro, I sit on the board of Humanist Australia and I was Vice President of Humanist Victoria for a couple of times. I'm also passionate about creating a society where every human being can reach their potential. Humanists act to defend those who do not have a voice, including the poor, our Indigenous peoples, and factory farmed animals. As a humanist, this is what gets me out of bed in the morning. Okay, so that's a little about my background and what attracted me to humanism. Now, you may be asking yourself, but what exactly is a humanist approach to life and living, and how does it differ from other approaches? I think the humanist approach can be summed up in these 3 themes or principles. First, the reliance on reason and evidence. 2, enacting compassion and equality. And third, promoting our autonomy and dignity. So I want to expand now a little on these three key dimensions. The first, reason and evidence. The first thing to note is that humanists respect reason and evidence. Humanists think that it is through the use of logic and reason that we can reliably arrive at truths about ourselves and the universe. Conversely, we don't consider intuition and faith as reliable guides to knowledge. We think that our personal beliefs should align with the strength of the evidence put to us. Hence, as we've already seen, reason and the reliance on evidence is one of Humanist Australia's core values. But what does that mean? In the social sphere, we think that public policy should be informed by the best scientific evidence we have available. Applying this principle puts into serious question the effectiveness of pseudo-medical treatments such as iridology and homeopathy. Another recent example is the damage done to the public health by anti-vaxxers and conspiracy theorists. You may remember a recent shocking, disturbing, depressing example of the death of a 9-year-old girl suffering diabetes, and the parents for the second time withheld her diabetic medication, thinking that God was going to keep her well, and unfortunately she died. I think the parents, the leader of the congregation, some of the others got a number of years in jail from memory. So this principle of reason and evidence also encourage us to get acting on climate change before it's too late. Applying the scientific method leads us to what's called a naturalistic view of humans and the universe. Science teaches us that the visible universe is some 14 billion years old, that there are 4 fundamental forces of nature, and that life evolved over some 3.5 billion years of evolution on Earth, with Homo sapiens first appearing some 200,000 years ago. Now, that doesn't mean that we know everything, and there are no deep mysteries yet to be solved. Scientists are working on figuring out what happens inside a black hole, how quantum entanglement is possible, and what is the nature of dark matter and dark energy. Perhaps the biggest and most elusive mystery is the nature of consciousness. How do the 80 billion neurons that make up a normal living human brain give rise to the feeling of love and, say, the sensation of a red rose? We're still no closer to that. So humanists, and I'll add in here atheists as well, are sometimes thought of as joyless worshippers of cool, hard reason, with no appreciation of love, wonder, music, and art. But nothing could be further from the truth. Humanists stand in awe at the magnificent complexity of the universe, the beauty of nature, the all-encompassing power of love, and the inspiration that drives art and music. A great antidote to this misconception is Chris Johnson's fabulously illustrated book. Some of you may have seen it. It's called A Better Life, 100 Atheists Speak Out on Joy and Meaning in a World Without God. Now, I would have brought it along tonight, but it's a big coffee table book. It's about this big. It's got 100 stories in there. Now, Chris Johnson, the author, he recently visited Australia. We managed for him to bring over a few copies of the book, and he did a talk for us. I've already run the first Saturday reflection based on the book, and I plan on doing that maybe once every 3 months at this stage. It's called a Saturday reflection or Sunday reflection, depending on which morning we do it in. And we just pick one of the stories from Chris Johnson's great book. And there's stories about how atheists, humanists get a lot of joy and meaning in life without God. And I must say, I mean, as you know, this is something theists, religious people just fail to comprehend, how somebody who doesn't believe in God doesn't just go out and literally want to kill themselves. I mean, William Lane Craig, the world's most well-known living Christian philosopher and theologian, he argues seriously that if you're an atheist, you literally have no reason to live. It's quite extraordinary. So that's reason and evidence. The next humanist principle is compassion and equality. Regard for other human beings and all other sentient creatures stands at the centre of the humanist outlook. Our feelings of empathy and our drive to act altruistically are encoded in our genes and reinforced through our upbringing. As Harvard University psychologist Steven Pinker described it, our desires to help those who are suffering reflects what he calls the better angels of our nature. But to whom ought we show our compassion? To our family? To our friends? Well, I say, of course, but who else? For a humanist, what marks a truly moral act is one in which we treat people as equals, that is, that we treat people impartially. So for a humanist, you ought not get special treatment just because you are white or wealthy or heterosexual or a male. Treating people as equals is fundamental to what it is to act morally. In addition to Humanist Australia's valuing of compassion, our other value of diversity is the one that emphasises treating people with equal respect. For humanists, this imperative to treat people with compassion and as equals did not come from above or beyond. It's the result of our long evolutionary history in which we evolved to form cooperative social groups. So let me illustrate this idea. Imagine for a moment, all of you here going on a holiday by sea. Your ship becomes stranded on a desert island with none of the crew surviving. You're left with some food, materials to make some shelter, and the natural resources on the island. To survive individually and as a group, what rules would you make to govern your behaviour? Would you decide on the rule, kill your fellow survivors when you can get away with it? Would you choose steal from the food store when no one is looking? Would you decide on break your promises when you can't be bothered keeping them? Or would you, as a group, decide on the opposite? You see, for a humanist, there is nothing mysterious or out of this world about the moral rules that we want others to live by. They are simply the rules that we must all conform to if we are to get the mutual benefits of cooperation for us to survive and thrive. Now, I go to many talks. Some of the talks I go to are religious people who believe in some kind of supernaturalism, and that without this supernatural entity, spirits, pantheistic cosmos, transcendent God, without something out there, our morality lacks grounding. And I think that's completely mistaken. I mean, for one thing, it means for me to have an obligation to help the poor or to keep my promises, for me to justify that obligation, I first have to buy into this big, grand metaphysical scheme. So on that account, if I want to convince you to give to the poor, on that account, I first have to convince you of my religious or grand metaphysical beliefs, which are, for some of these people, they're complicated arguments. And I'm saying all of that is completely unnecessary. Our moral obligations to each other are grounded simply in our mutual sympathy and the rules that we mutually have to agree to be able to survive as a cooperative community. There's nothing mysterious about it. So as civilizations have progressed, the range of people to which we show compassion and equal regard has expanded. Slaves, women, gays and lesbians, and our Indigenous peoples are more and more treated as equals. At their noblest, the world's religions actively promote this idea of compassion for all, regardless of a person's religious belief, ancestry, gender, and sexual preference. There's this great little poster. So this universalist ethos is best expressed in the Golden Rule, shown in this great little poster. The golden rule, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. The golden rule can be found in the holy texts of all of the major world views, as illustrated in this poster. It goes through something like a dozen of the major worldviews and shows you where in their key religious texts you will find the golden rule. I've got the URL for that if you want to download it. I was at a symposium and managed to get the hard copy, but you can download it and print it out on your printer. And I suppose this is what perturbs me about the interfaith movement. As much as I love the interfaith movement, because all the people of the different religions get to hold hands, live together, and behave like humanists, right? But they still think they're special. They still think that they've got this secret, mysterious ingredient that atheist humanists don't have. So no, this poster is just for the religious, but it does illustrate a really important point, that the foundation of morality, reciprocal action, looking after your brother and sister because they will look after you, this common empathy, that you don't need a religious underpinning for that. And I suppose, I mean, I like this poster because it shows where humanists, atheists, and the religious can agree. Now, I'll talk about the not so good side of religion now. Now, unfortunately, as history teaches us, many of these worldviews, the religious worldviews, have also divided us into an in-group and an out-group, the sheep and the goats, the saved and the infidel, the chosen race and the outcast. Humanists actively work to reduce this blind prejudice, this sectarianism that divides us, to build strong bridges between community groups and nations. Another way of expressing this universal regard for others is the utilitarian principle. Act so as to bring about the most happiness and the least suffering. Since the 1970s, this feeling of universal regard is continuing to expand bit by bit as we include non-human animals now within our circle of care. Okay, so that's compassion and equality. So moving on to the third key humanist principle, autonomy and dignity. The third humanist principle that I want to outline here is this one, autonomy and dignity. With this principle, we affirm that everyone should be able to go about their lives without unnecessary restrictions by the government and other people. We ought to be given our autonomy, the freedom to do what we want to the maximum extent possible. And of course, and that's why I was reflecting on my earlier life, this is absolutely contrary to the despotic totalitarian regimes that want everyone to be cast in the same mold with very strict controls on behavior, like the high control religions as well. I mean, that's what high control religions have in common with totalitarianism. So constraints on our freedom should occur only when our actions restrict the freedom of others or cause them harm. For example, it is this principle that motivated humanists for many decades to campaign against laws that criminalized homosexuality. I mean, for the humanists starting in the 1960s, the modern humanist organizations really started campaigning hard for liberalization of homosexual laws from the 1960s. But we trace it back to the Enlightenment. I mentioned Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill, who were campaigners against these restrictive laws on homosexuality. Humanists regard freedom as an ideal because each of us is different. Each of us has our own unique talents and dispositions, drives and values. Global research shows that it is only by exercising our freedom that we can fully put our special capabilities and plans towards creating our own happiness. It is this capacity for happiness and suffering that also gives us our inherent dignity. Each of us is a unique sentient being, a universe in our own right. Each of us is a locus of consciousness. One person's pleasure and pain is of no greater or lesser value than any other's. It is this belief in the inherent dignity of each person and of their worth as autonomous agents of their own future that humanists have campaigned hard for various legislative reforms. A recent example here is our fight for a person's legal right to die if they are suffering from intolerable and unavoidable pain. So the voluntary assisted dying laws here in Australia, there's only one Commonwealth territory left to go, Northern Territory. All the other territory, ACT, and all the states now have voluntary assisted dying laws, which, like the liberalisation of, in particular, the gay marriage laws, and now with the voluntary assisted dying laws, I was quite taken aback how quick the social change has been. And I think that's because we're a more non-religious and educated public now. I put it down to that. Well, at least two of the key factors. So it is in the name of this principle, autonomy and dignity, also that humanists historically campaigned against slavery and much later for full civil rights for women and blacks. For a humanist, even if there is no higher power looking over us, fighting for freedom and the inherent dignity of all, regardless of race, gender, social position, and sexual preference, is worth doing. Okay, so that covers what I see as the three key principles. When you look across the various humanist organisations around the world, including Humanist International, you'll see these three key principles may be expressed in a little bit different language, but when I look at all the humanist documents, national and international, they all highlight these three key principles. Okay, so I now want to say a little about the humanist conception of the good life. What is a worthwhile life and how ought we live it? The three humanist principles I've just described, I think, give us a way to think about what it is to lead a good life. First, let me distinguish the humanist view of a good life from other ways of looking at the question. You could think that asking the question, what is a good life, is like asking, what is a good knife? How do we answer what is a good knife? Well, by first asking, what is the function of a knife? Well, it's to cut. A good knife then is a knife that cuts well. That is, it has a easy to grip handle, has a sharp blade, and so on. The salient point here is that what makes for a good knife is determined by the purpose of a knife. And a knife's purpose is not given by the knife itself. The purpose of a knife is external to the knife itself. Now, you may think that humans are like that. And actually, this is the Aristotelian view, which really dominated all the way through the early Christian church and through the Middle Ages up until recently, although there are still Aristotelians today arguing this. You may think that a good human is determined by the function, the purpose of a human. And like knives, the purpose of a human is dictated to humans from outside. In contrast to this way of thinking, a humanist thinks that human beings determine their own purpose, that humans have no function that is dictated from above or beyond. This thinking is in line with the humanist principle of autonomy and dignity that I shared with you. Each of us has plans and projects that we wish to pursue. Some of us embark on a lifetime of service to the poor and dispossessed. Some want to build the best model railways ever. Some devote their lives to finding a cure for autism, or discovering what's inside a black hole, or to bringing pleasure to others through music. Global studies on happiness and well-being show that the happiest, most contented people are those who can determine their own life trajectory without it having dictated to them. So for a humanist, this is part of what it is to lead a good life. The second principle I mentioned, compassion and equality, complements the value of a life that is lived pursuing one's own plans and interests. To live a good life, that is, a life that has moral value and not simply one that satisfies its owner, is to live a life of compassion and justice. For a humanist, though, living a good life does not require you to live like a saint, sacrificing your happiness and well-being entirely for the benefit of others. That would be to deprive yourself of your own dignity and value. To live a good life, however, does mean alleviating the sufferings of others where you can and fighting for justice, the equal treatment of others where you see people being treated unfairly. Again, research shows that for people whose lives are deeply embedded within their families and communities, they live more fulfilling and satisfying lives. Living in service to others not only enriches their lives, but also your own. And that's the one thing I notice about humanist communities, not only here in Australia, but when I look at them in the United States, in the UK, they do a lot of work in developing this sense of community. Like here, we have our regular get-togethers and talk over coffee. It's building those personal relationships, which gives all of us an extra depth to our lives. The first humanist principle, reason and evidence, also plays an important role in living the good life. This may sound counterintuitive. What has reasoning correctly got to do with living a moral life? Let me give you a true life example. Naima is a cancer patient. She foregoes cancer treatment for an expensive quack cure from a snake oil merchant. This is a real life case. Naima dies prematurely, robbing her of another few years of productive life and robbing her parents of their daughter. Her untimely death was good for no one, not for her, not for her family, and not for all of her friends who cared about her. Here is another example of how ignoring reason and evidence detracts from living a good life. I set up and run Australia's first ex-religious support network. In my work, I hear all too often stories from people who left a very strict and controlling religious sect. To their deep regret and sadness, they feel that much of their life had been wasted. Within the sect, they were not allowed to have birthday parties, to dance and sing, to search the internet, and to go on to university. The imposition of these irrational religious constraints, they felt, stole from them their childhood and early adult years. Perhaps the most alarming example on a global scale of how turning a blind eye to reason and evidence can rob us of a good life is our current climate catastrophe. If the world's governments continue to ignore the scientific evidence, with the inevitable result that our climate passes the global warming tipping point, if it hasn't already, billions of people will suffer. Billions will be impacted by increased storms, bushfires and floods, and water shortages, rising sea levels and wars over scarce resources. To finish on a more positive note, I want to emphasise that for a humanist, there is not one way and one way only of living a good life. We each have our own talents and drives to make this world a better place, and in a way that is uniquely ours. Humanism is a truly pluralist worldview that cherishes diversity, both in thought and action. Humanists are striving for a more tolerant world in which all of us can reach our potential while respecting the rights and freedoms of our fellow world citizens. So in this talk, to sum up, I shared with you what attracted me to the humanist outlook. Principally, its respect for reason and science and its deep engagement with the world. And I outlined what I see as the three key principles of humanism: reason and evidence, compassion and equality, and autonomy and dignity. And I ended with the humanist conception of what it is to lead a good life. At its heart, it's a life in which we continually search for the truth and to strive to enrich the lives of others. So here's a list of resources on humanism. Actually, I've got, if you want to get the list of resources, I've got some printouts here. So it includes the text of this talk, and John's going to release the video of this as well. There's a couple of great little PDF books on humanism, very down to earth. You can download them free. And there's 2 or 3 key humanist websites. And if you want to contact me, you can contact me in any number of ways. And I do encourage you to check out the Humanist Australia website. You can find us on Facebook. We've got a Humanist Australia meetup group. Contact us by email as well. So maybe if you're to get your thinking juices going, here's some prompts for discussion and thinking. What does humanism mean to you? Second, what gives your life meaning and purpose? And third, does a good life mean helping others to live a good life too? So thank you for your attention.
Well, thank you very much, Les. Before we go on to questions, I'd like to remind you that we're very grateful to the Unitarians for the use of their hall. And if you do have any ability to make a contribution, we'll find some receptacle to pass around. Les, thank you very much for the talk. It was very informative, comprehensive, and also your contribution as a humanist and the work you do, I think it's most admirable and well done on that. It's definitely a worthy cause, and it's much appreciated, your work and your talks that you give to us. Okay, then, Steve, what do you reckon?
It's okay to talk from there, is it?
I'll test. Yes, Ken can hear you, so that's good. If he can hear you, it's getting onto the Zoom.
Well, anyway, many years ago, so when I was reading about Kant, I remember Kant's made the statement that what inspired him were the starry heavens above and the moral law within. So he established this dichotomy. Well, the starry heavens above. The reference point is fact. It's something real. Now, when it comes to the moral law within, we're dealing with values which aren't facts of nature. I mean, we're more or less all going to agree on the facts of nature, except sometimes we don't. Mostly we can. But when it comes to values, these can vary enormously amongst human cultures. Now, when the Christians came along with their cosmic dictator, so I like to call it, the Christians felt, well, I've got this guy that created facts, which I experience externally, and it's objective, and people tend to agree what the facts are. And on the other hand, my values, which don't seem to have really an objective anchor, but nevertheless, this grand being, this God, it's going to become the guarantor and warranty of both factors, both external facts and, say, inner values. So I was wondering what Les can say about the problems of establishing values for somebody that no longer has the imaginary guarantee of this cosmic dictator. Thank you.
Yeah, so as I was trying to illuminate in my talk, humanists and I have what's called a naturalist conception of ethics. True, if you want to call them true moral judgments are not about facts or properties up there or existing in things independently of human beings. Morality is in some sense, in an important sense, constructed like money. So because money is a human construct and it's got a physical instantiation in terms of coins, even ones and zeros in computer systems, money is a human construction, and we say that there is a monetary system, that money exists. So in the same way, I see morality as a lot like that. It is a human construction for a purpose. And the function of morality is to ground, enunciate rules that we all agree to live by so that we can live in cooperative societies. Because living in cooperative societies, like all of us recognise, is the way we achieve not only our own personal interests, but also our communal interests. When we have regard for our family and our friends and our work peers, and even more broader than that, we have an empathy for the people in the next suburb and in the next country. So anyway, the short answer is you're right. Morality is not about some human independent realm. Morality for a humanist is about how we decide to live together so we can all advance our own personal and social interests.
I'd like to make a few comments and also put something to Les and he can comment on. We at the Atheist Society here, obviously, yeah, I'm thinking about the overlap and the difference between, let's say, atheism and humanism, and also the other kind of free thought groups like, or concepts like rationalism, skepticism, and secularism, all of which have their own kind of different organizations. And so let me put it what I think is or at least the overlap, because particularly regarding atheism, I think it certainly doesn't contradict anything that Les put forward as humanism. But I think in one way it's a much narrower concept, because it just looks at the existence or the non-existence of gods and supernatural beings, and so it's kind of got a narrow focus, and it doesn't have the sort of moral dimensions that humanism puts forward. But so it doesn't mean that atheism or the atheist society as well doesn't have a value, because I think it's just a different emphasis that these groups have. Like, for example, the skeptics, they focus on frauds and scams and other things like that. So yeah, so that was my idea, just the difference and then the overlap. Les, what do you think?
Oh, absolutely. So I agree. Atheism is simply the view, and there's big debate amongst atheists and religious people whether atheism is a positive belief, a positive assertion that there is no God, or whether it's the milder negative view that I ain't seen no evidence for God. So it's just a lack of belief, and there's never-ending arguments. I never start arguing about that on the forums, that some of the forums that I'm on. So yes, atheism is much more restricted. It's just the non-acceptance of a belief in God, whereas humanism encompasses that social realm and the realm of meaning and purpose, ethics, politics, and rationalism. The rationalist society, I think, was probably the first secular kind of society that officially started here in Australia. And the rationalists have probably more of it's really hard to pin down, because I see the Rationalist Society of Australia so similar to the humanist societies. Maybe just a little bit less emphasis on, a little bit less emphasis on the broader social issues like animal suffering, taxation system, housing, the indigenous. These are all issues that humanists are concerned about, and not so much the rationalists. The rationalists are much more focused on the overreach of religion, like in the voluntary assisted dying laws, issues to do with separation of church and state, parliamentary prayers, funding of religious schools. So the rationalists are a fair bit more focused on those overreach of religion issues. And of course, I think there's a role for all of these societies because they have different emphases and people in them have different interests and foci. I mean, we sometimes think about, wouldn't it be great if we all got together and just formed one super organisation? Some people still dream of that. I don't think it's ever, I'm very doubtful that it will ever happen because people have different personalities and different interests and focus.
Ken, I will just go to you. I've got one more comment. One advantage of atheism, I find, is that most people know what it means. I mean, you don't have to really explain it, whereas the other things, people require a little bit of explanation. Anyway, Ken, if you unmute, I think we'll be able to hear you. Go ahead.
Can you hear me? Can you hear me loud and clear? 5 by 5. Okay. I just want to thank Les for this particular presentation. I've been meaning to have a chat with him because I'm wrapped in humanism, and I visited it some years ago and thought, well, this isn't doing much. But now humanism is doing stuff. They are getting together on a global scale and documenting manifestos and starting to do real stuff. And think I've found an anchor point to answer the last sort of question about where does atheism fit in with, humanism and religions. To me, the anchor point is our belief systems, and it takes into account our individuality. We all develop an individual belief system, and it was interesting to hear how Les's belief system developed, and we've all got that story of how our belief system has changed, and my belief system's changed enormously over my retirement period where I've been studying human flourishing. Now, human flourishing is determined virtually by a matter of luck and good management by your parents who've given you a good belief system, and your society has given you a good belief system. And the only suggestion I would love to see is for humanism to lay down the glove to the religious belief systems, which to me have lots of negative aspects, which Les mentioned a few of them. We could start what I would call a universal belief system, which I could see the state governments starting to teach, or at least lay down, and challenge the religions to come up with something as good as. Thanks, Les. Thanks, John.
Thanks, Ken. I find in all of the major religions, within them, there's a huge amount of variety. So Hinduism, even Buddhism, Christianity, Islam, Judaism, all of them have the super orthodox, super high control, super dogmatic variant. At the other end, the fluffy humanistic type variant, let everyone live their own lives. There is no one absolute truth. Everyone can formulate their own beliefs with freedom, let people live their own lives. But this fluffy version thinks that we have something important to tell you about how to get a meaningful life. So all the way from the very strict dogmatic high control variant to the fluffy liberal variant, and then everything in between. I don't think we're ever going to get away from that. I don't think we're ever going to get to the stage where everyone believes the same thing or has the same worldview.
That's not the point.
The guy who wrote Sex and God is a counsellor, and he also wrote The God Virus. Can't remember. In one of his books, he was citing the studies on identical and fraternal twins to show how much of religious belief is genetically determined and how much is determined by your environment. And these twin studies come around about the 50%. Whether you're religious or non-religious, 50% comes down to your genes, and the other 50% comes down to your upbringing, your environment. So that's one reason why I think we're never going to get, well, certainly never going to get rid of religious belief. I mean, at the moment, New Zealand's just got over 50% of the population in the last census is non-religious. If we get to 80% saying they're non-religious, that's pretty good. We've got a question down there.
Ask with your third thing about economy and freedom, right? And has humanism settled the question of whether humans actually have free will?
Right. So among humanists, probably there's two dominant positions. They all agree almost unanimously. You might get an official humanist here and there saying we ain't got free will because determinism is true, but I think they'd be pretty rare, especially among the leaders, the people writing the books, the humanists writing the books and leading the organisations. I think you'd be hard pressed to find what are called a hard determinist, somebody who thinks determinism is true and we don't have free will. I think they'd be a rare breed. So most humanists think we do have free will, and that's really, really important because we believe in democracy. It's not much point giving people a say in their lives if you think they ain't got no say because everyone's determined by the cosmic forces. And we also believe in autonomy, everyone having the right to live their lives as they choose. So free will is an important concept for humanists by and large. Now, will be a split between those humanists, the humanists who believe in free will and those who are determinists and those who are what are called indeterminists, who think that determinism doesn't hold complete sway. I don't know what the proportion is. I would suspect that most ordinary humanists haven't even thought about the question of whether free will is compatible with determinism, haven't thought about the question of determinism at all. So I'm a compatibilist myself. I think that determinism is true and that we do have free will. But how many humanists are like me and how many humanists think that I do know one humanist. I know one humanist who thinks that we have free will and determinism is false. Now, what proportion that is, I couldn't tell you. Joe?
I understand that UK, Norway, and Netherlands, the humanist organisations have very large memberships, over 100,000. In Australia, humanists are a very small number. You have any theories about why this is done?
I think Norway is a recognised worldview or something like that by the government. So it gets an allowance, same with the religions. They get an allowance, I think, based on how many members they have. So the Norway Humanist Party is quite well funded because they get funds from the government. The UK, I think, has got a very strong humanist presence because when I think of where modern humanism began with David Hume Scottish, Jeremy Bentham in England, John Stuart Mill in England. The birth of modern humanism was in the UK, including Scotland, was in the UK. And I think, and that was also, along with Europe, was the birthplace of the Enlightenment. And the Enlightenment, the scientific revolution, were the breeding ground for the later humanist, the more formal humanist movements, especially starting in the mid 1800s. So I think that's why the UK has got such a strong membership, because of that historical, I mean, that's where it all started. And we want to see that, you know, we can learn a lot from the way humanists build their membership. And we're trying hard with Humanist Australia. I mean, the trick is to get the message out to the general public. That's the hard bit, to get the message out to the general public.
One thing is that atheism is much more narrow than humanism, but I think that belief in gods or supernaturals is kind of the biggest opposition to humanism. Like it's only a small thing, but it's a very important thing, because you know most of the population suffer from religious delusions, most of which are state sponsored. So it's kind of it's narrow, but it's also broad in its narrow in its philosophy, but broad in its effect on society. I'll put it that way. There's no more questions. I just got a few more announcements. First of all, I want to say something about Jeremy Bentham, because he's got an ongoing contribution to humanism, in the sense that his body has been embalmed and is on display at Birkbeck College in London, of which I'm an alumni. And you can actually go there, and it's in a cabinet. You can, I don't know what his purpose was, but he wanted to, must have been his will to put his body on display there. Just want to let you know that got a few other speakers lined up, one of which is Nick, who's here, and he hasn't given us a topic yet, but he's on the list here. We've also got Lara Kaput lined up. Joe Sampson, I'll have to correct the website, is in December. Next month, we've got Heen Hit Kwor from the Burmese Atheists. It will be on Zoom. And his topic is Decolonize Anti-Woke Atheism Beyond Western Values. So that will be a topic which is probably quite unusual and interesting. So if there's nothing else, I'd just like to thank you again, Les, for attending today. And we have tea and coffee in the kitchen.